Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 613. I am a cat. I don't know about you, but after the last few weeks, I could use a break from the heavy stuff, so let's have a nice, relaxed time and just talk about a book. So if you went to Japan any time between the 1980s and 2007, you probably had to take out at least some cash. Even today, Japan's not quite as cashless as other places I've been, and certainly 2 decades ago, most things still had to be bought the old-fashioned way. In turn, you probably had a lot of 1,000 yen notes on you, the equivalent of about $10 in the US. And up until 2007, the Series D version of the 1,000 yen note, one of the most common banknotes in Japan, had on its reverse side a portrait of a handsome man with a mustache and some very nice hair. His name was Natsume Soseki, and as you might guess, given his rather prestigious spot on the nation's currency, he's kind of a big deal. As a side note, his banknote, the Series D, is no longer in circulation. The Series E and F notes that are now in circulation show Noguchi Hideo and Kitasato Shibasaburo, respectively. The former helped determine the bacteriological cause of syphilis, leading to our modern ability to treat it. The latter, almost simultaneously with Alexander Yersin, discovered the bacteria behind bubonic plague, so both kind of a big deal too. Anyway, Natsume Soseki specifically is certainly one of the most famous writers in modern Japanese history. I am not an expert on literary history, but in terms of both domestic and international renown, my sense is that really the only other people in the same ballpark are Japan's 2 Nobel laureates, Kawabata Yasunari and Oe Kenzaburo, plus the master of horror Akutagawa Ryunosuke, and probably today Murakami Haruki. Maybe you could put Mishima Yukio up there too, though in my experience, he tends to be more famous for how he died than what he wrote. What I'm getting at here is specifically that Natsume Soseki is kind of a big deal and also someone I have not really talked about that much over the course of the podcast. We've dealt with a lot of the other big names of Japanese literature, and so at long last, it's time to address this, and thankfully the timing is good. Tuttle Publishing has just put out a new edition of its 1-volume English translation of Natsume Soseki's most famous work, Waga Hai wa Neko de Aru, or I Am a Cat, by the translation duo of Aiko Ito and Graham Wilson, and a separate manga adaptation by Kobato Chiroru and Zach Davison. So at long last, let's talk about Natsume Soseki, his work, and more broadly, a bit about the challenges of literature and translation, but first, I should cop to something. In a certain sense, I'm kind of not the best person for this, because I really have to confess something. I don't like most Meiji period literature, and here again I have to admit a tragic lacuna in my own education. I actually hadn't read much more than snippets of Natsume Soseki before working on this episode. You see, the Japanese literature classes I took as a historian were generally surveys. We didn't spend that much time on the whole of Meiji-era literature, that period from 1868 to 1912, and only touched on a small handful of writers, 4 in particular. I loved Akutagawa Ryunosuke, who technically is a Taisho period, he's the next era. Horror is always fun. I found Higuchi Ichio really interesting for a perspective on gender relations during the period. She's the subject of episode 317. But the other 2 canonical writers that we looked at, Tanizaki Junichiro and Mori Ogai, I feel bad saying this, but I just found them desperately boring. To be fair, that's not entirely their fault. As with so much in Meiji-era Japan, the literature of this period was dominated by a single theme: comparison to and imitation of Western civilization and enlightenment. The Meiji era, which again ran from 1868 to 1912, was the dawn of the modern Japanese nation-state, and with it the Japanese Empire, run by former samurai who overthrew feudalism and then decided that the very feudal system that privileged their warrior status was an outmoded danger to the survival of Japan itself. So they cast aside the old system and built a new one based on openness to Western ideas and technology, and of course using those ideas and technology to build the strongest and most possible state possible to stave off Western imperial powers, which had forced their way into Japan. And so particularly in the first decades of this new era, in almost every field of endeavor, you see this constant slavish imitation of Western ideas. The spirit of the early Meiji period in particular is probably best summed up by a quote from the intellectual Fukuzawa Yukichi In his newspaper Jiji Shimpo, or Current Events, which I am sure I have repeated many times over and over here, but I think it's very good for conveying the flavor of the era. Quote, "If we compare the knowledge of Japanese and Westerners in letters, in techniques, in commerce, or in industry from the largest to the smallest matter, there is not one thing in which we excel. Outside of the most stupid person in the world, no one would say our learning or business is on par with those of Western countries. Who could compare our carts with their locomotives, our swords with their pistols? We speak of yin and yang in the 5 elements. They have discovered 60 elements. In the present condition, there is nothing in which we may feel pride vis-a-vis the West. All Japan has to be proud of is its scenery." As you might imagine, that sort of mindset sets a real tone for the period. The early Meiji intellectuals who typified this view responded by imitating everything from Western dress and manners to artistic sensibilities, including literature. And that's just deeply unfortunate because, and here again I reveal my prejudice, the Victorian literature of this era is just, in my view, deeply and profoundly boring. I'm sorry if you like it, I really am, I just hate it so much. It tends to this self-seriousness and melodrama I found deeply dull, particularly compared to earlier periods in especially English language writing. I mean, Jane Austen knew how to have fun when she wrote. Did fun become illegal when Queen Victoria took over or something? Anyway, the Japanese writers of this period had a real tendency to imitate these elements of Victorian high literature, which, as with everything else, was associated with superior Western civilization, and the results are just, I'm sorry you guys, they're just not fun to read. I found Mori Ogai, whose short stories I had to slog through, and Tanizaki Junichiro, whose novel Naomi was required reading in one of my classes, just so boring. Mostly, again, because everything felt like a grim melodrama with a lot of navel-gazing and no humor or vitality. And because this is the internet, I do feel required to remind everyone here it is okay to like something, even if I don't, arguably, especially if I don't. I am not the arbiter of all taste, especially on literature. My opinions on Meiji-era literature, clearly, judging by the classes I have taken, are not in the majority anyway. I am just using the podcast to get some catharsis about having to slog through a short story about a boring, self-obsessed self-insert, flirting badly with a German girl, knocking her up, and then being all woe is me about ditching her to go back to Japan. That's right, Mori Ogai, I see you. I know that Mai Hime is just a boring story that's your weird, self-obsessed fantasy and made me think you were a massive tool. I'd say fight me, but you've been dead for 104 years, so get wrecked, I guess. Anyway, all this baggage did not really prep me for the best reception of Natsume Soseki, which is why it really surprised me how much I actually enjoyed him. Let's talk about why. And of course, you know what this means. It's time for backstory. So, first things first, Natsume Soseki is a pen name. Natsume Kinnosuke is his birth name, though, following my standard practice, I will use his more famous moniker from this point forward, which means we're sticking to the pen name. He was born on February 9th, 1867, in what was then the Ushigomi Babashitacho area of Edo. Now it's the Kikuicho area of Shinjuku Ward in Tokyo, right near the Waseda subway stop in the western part of the center of the city. His parents were Natsume Naokatsu and Natsume Chie, and Soseki was the youngest of 8 children, 5 boys and 3 girls. Like most Japanese families in the feudal era, the Natsumes had a hereditary occupation. Natsume Naokatsu was the Nanushi, the ward chief for his part of Edo. Essentially, he was a commoner chosen to represent the interests of his neighborhood to the samurai-run government, the equivalent of an appointed mayor for his part of the city. As a result, the Natsumes were decently well off, but 1 year after their last son was born, the whole feudal system that gave them this special job imploded, and in its wake, Natsume Naokatsu lost his livelihood. As a result, the Natsumes fell on hard time, and Natsume Soseki grew up in rather difficult circumstances. They were so straitened, in fact, that at one point, the Natsume family gave him up for adoption to some childless acquaintances, not uncommon for a family that was on its 5th son and 8th child overall. That's a lot of mouths to feed. Eventually, his birth family did reclaim him, After both some disputes with the adoptive family about how to raise him, and after finding better financial footing, but apparently they didn't tell him the truth about who they were, and claimed they were just his grandparents. A maid let it slip to him by accident when he was still young. Still, despite this chaotic upbringing, Natsume Soseki had one big advantage thanks to one of the new directives of this new government, the same one that was so focused on modernizing Japan. Young Natsume Soseki, like every other child in the country, became eligible for a free state-sponsored education in the growing network of national public schools. The early schools were pretty chaotic, a slapdash effort left largely to the locals both to organize and fund, and in his teen years, Natsume Soseki had a chance to switch over to a private academy for Chinese studies when he showed a lot of aptitude for his work. Academies like that were hitting hard times during the period. The Meiji craze for all things Western meant that fewer and fewer people were sending their children for a classical Chinese or Confucian education. But it also meant tuitions were much lower. The iron law of supply and demand was in effect, and so the Natsumes could afford to send their son to a school that, maybe 10 years earlier, would have been far, far harder for them to afford. And I think this part of his backstory accounts for at least some of why I enjoy Natsume Soseki more than a lot of other Meiji period writers. Mori Ogai, to my understanding, took some basic studies in Chinese poetry, but that was about it. Tanizaki Junichiro had a largely, as far as I know, entirely Western education. Natsume Soseki, by comparison, had a real passion for Chinese literature and all its varieties, and more broadly, for the classical literary tradition of East Asia. And that means his work has a much more distinctive feel than a lot of other Meiji period writers because it doesn't feel as imitative of the Victorian models of the day. Natsume Soseki was famous for including allusions in his work to the literary classics of Asia, crafting these references and connections to stories set in the modern day, and I think it makes his work feel much more distinctive than many of his contemporaries. But a passion for the classics could only get you so far in the early 1880s when young Soseki was entering his teen years, and so he did start to study English alongside Chinese. Among other things, English was at the time an entrance requirement for Tokyo Imperial University, which he did aspire to attend. He eventually left his Chinese private school behind for the Tokyo First Higher Normal School, or Ichiko for short, basically the feeder school for Tokyo Imperial University at that time. In short order, he became very proficient with English, graduated first in his class, and got the admission he so hoped for. Initially, he'd hoped to study engineering and architecture, but when he was finally admitted to university, he apparently had a crisis of faith when a friend told him that no Japanese architect would ever be able to create something that matched Natsume Soseki's favorite project, St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Now that is just a classic Meiji period inferiority complex right there. Broken-hearted, Natsume Soseki basically fell into a specialization in English literature almost by accident, and would eventually graduate from university and take up a teaching post in English Lit because he felt he really had nothing else to offer. Still, he would be dogged by constant doubts. He was apparently deeply self-critical and insecure. You might get that from him changing his whole life path, based on one offhanded comment from an acquaintance, and later in life he would also deal with some pretty profound mental illness. He was constantly critical of his ability to understand English from a foreign perspective, and at one point would have such a crisis of confidence in himself that he went into a multi-month retreat at a Zen temple in Kamakura before quitting his teaching job at Tokyo Imperial University to move to rural Shikoku and teach there instead, hoping, in his own words, to, quote, bury himself. That didn't quite work out, though. Instead, he came out of his dark period of self-doubt with two new things to show for it. The first was a marriage to a child of a locally prominent family, one Nakane Kyoko, daughter of a local government official. This was an arranged marriage and apparently not the happiest, particularly as Natsume's mental health got worse and worse. Their relationship was marred by fighting. Mental health treatment being what it was in the late 19th and early 20th century, we're not quite sure what was going on. The most common guess is untreated bipolar disorder, made worse by some other medical issues, particularly stomach ulcers and diabetes later in his life. When he was feeling well, Natsume Soseki was apparently a very good husband, but when he was not, things could get very bad. The couple would still end up having 7 children together, but it probably didn't help their relationship that 2 of them did die in infancy. The other thing that would emerge out of Natsume Soseki's sojourn in Shikoku was an order in 1900 to go overseas. The Ministry of Education apparently did not share Natsume Soseki's assessment that his understanding of English was insufficient, and ordered him to spend 2 years in London studying and then return to a teaching gig in Tokyo. Natsume felt he had no choice. Remember, the whole education system was run by the central government, so he couldn't exactly say no to anything they wanted, and so he relocated to London for 2 years. You might think a guy who studied English all his life would at least be interested in living in London for a bit. Now that I've been, I can say it's a pretty fun city. But Natsume Soseki apparently did not share my vision, referring to his time in the UK as a, quote, very trying experience in a letter home, and being even more on the nose later in life, quote, the 2 years I spent in London were the most miserable of my life. Apparently a big part of the issue was simply how he was treated as a Japanese man living in the UK, generally socially isolated, treated as a strange foreigner. The experience was bad enough he ended up quitting the institution he'd been sent to study at, University College London, to pursue independent studies. Once again, he bucked the trend of the age by deciding he did not like Victorian literature, which is the objectively correct opinion on Victorian literature, and so he focused on writers from the 18th century, the 1700s, and earlier. He developed a particular interest in Shakespeare and ended up amassing a volume of somewhere around 400 books, either of English literature or related to the subject, before his return to Japan. This trip apparently also gave him the idea for what became his life's work, figuring out a new model of literature that was trying to, be insightful and say something, rather than just, as he saw Victorian literature, existing to be enjoyed by the rarefied elite who'd been trained into what they were supposed to enjoy. Starting on the project was a bit of a trial, though. Natsume threw himself into this with such a fervor that his landlady wrote back to Japan with worries that he had gone insane. He then went into a deeper spiral when news came from Japan that his close friend from school, and fellow literary man, and Japanese baseball legend Masao Kashiki had died tragically young. Eventually, the Ministry of Education would just decide to recall him a few months early. Upon his return to Japan, Natsume Soseki started his literary career in earnest. He returned to a teaching gig at Tokyo Imperial University, taking over for New Orleans native Lafcadio Hearn, subject of episode 75, but also started to write, working closely with one of the editors of a literary magazine called Hototogisu, or The Cuckoo, that had been founded by his dearly departed friend Masao Kashiki. And in 1905, Hototogisu published Chapter 1 of what would become Natsume's most famous and popular book, Waga hai wa neko de aru, or I Am a Cat. Initially, he'd planned to just write a short story. We'll obviously talk more about this in a second, but as you might gather from the title, the main character of the story was a cat, whose musings and observations about human society are the vehicle for a sort of satire and critique of Meiji Japan. But the original story was so popular, Natsume ended up expanding it into a multi-volume novel, and it launched his whole literary career into the stratosphere. He would produce several more novels in collaboration with Hototogisu and eventually become enough of a well-known literary figure to be offered arguably the greatest prize one could get. Today, Asahi Shimbun is mostly known as the publisher behind one of the biggest news corporations in Japan, but they also have a host of satellite publications that included, back in the day, literary magazines. In 1910, they offered Natsume Soseki a contract to write for them full-time as a salaried fiction writer, essentially paying him a fixed amount every month in exchange for all of his output. Natsume Soseki had never really liked teaching to begin with, so he was more than happy to quit his job and become a full-time salaried novelist, which, as an aside, really shows you how different the market for fiction was 100 years ago, before TV and radio, when that was the sort of thing that was possible. Anyway, Natsume Soseki would spend the remainder of his life working for Asahi Shimbun, putting out several more highly regarded novels, the best known of which is probably Kokoro, written in 1914. He also began mentoring a small stable of writers in his new views on modernist literature, modernism in this context being a literary movement focused on revamping the arts to be more responsive to the new conditions of modern society, and less, well, navel-gazy and pretentious. Which is a whole other thing we don't really have room to get into. There are definitely some modernist writers who were still pretty navel-gazy and pretentious, but basically Natsume's obsession with avoiding Victorian conventions and adapting literature to a more modern context made him very modernist in his outlook, and one of the young modernist writers who ended up in his orbit during this time was an up-and-coming fellow, by the way, of the name Akutagawa Ryunosuke. Unfortunately, Natsume Soseki's health remained a serious issue. In 1910, he had a hemorrhage caused by his stomach ulcers, which saw his health go into a substantial decline. He survived, his health was the subject of much frantic coverage in the news in the meantime, but never really regained his vitality. His mental health also remained very fragile, and at one point, Kyoko did move out of the family's home for several months during a particularly bad episode. Ultimately, in 1916, he would go into a massive downward spiral in the middle of working on his last novel, Meion, or Light and Darkness, and would die on December 9th. His last novel would remain unfinished, and supposedly his last words were, "must not die." So that's Natsume Soseki, but what about Waga Hai wa Neko de Aru, or I Am a Cat, the work that launched his whole career? Apparently the whole project almost never even got off the ground. Takahama Kyoshi, one of the editors of the literary magazine Hototogisu, really didn't like the first version of the story Natsume finished in 1904. It was only because Natsume was open to his feedback and willing to rewrite big chunks of what became the first chapter of the book that it was even published in the first place. The structure of the narrative, again, was pretty straightforward. The narrator, the cat in question, simply offers observations from his own perspective about the people he encounters in Japanese society who are mostly in the Meiji middle class. Natsume's goal was clearly to use his feline narrator to lampoon Meiji society. For example, the cat's story begins with him moving into the home of a teacher based in Tokyo, named in most translations Mr. Sneeze, who works as a high school English teacher but spends most of his time trying to impress people by faking being cultured. For example, he buys expensive foreign books to look like a man of taste, but invariably falls asleep and drools on himself as he tries to read them at night. He spends a lot of time learning how to chant no plays, but mostly does it on the toilet, repeating famous soliloquies from these plays as he takes his morning relief, shall we say. Indeed, very little of the book has to do with cats, despite the name. To the extent they show up, the cats are mostly just reflections of their human masters. For example, Blackie, the wiry cat owned by a local rickshaw driver, who, like his master, is physically tough and kinda scrappy. Over time, the whole cat lens as a framing device gets dropped more and more until basically the narrator is just describing the life of these middle-class members of Meiji society. Ultimately, what people responded to was less the cat framing device and more the satire element, and so that became the focus. Natsume would eventually end the novel very abruptly by just killing the narrating cat off. He gets into a beer bottle, gets drunk, and then falls into a clay water jar and drowns. I cannot stress enough how abrupt the ending is. In the Ito Wilson translation, the whole thing is 469 pages. The death scene just comes out of nowhere in the last 3. Presumably Natsume had just run out of witty commentary to offer and decided to make it clear the story was now over, to forestall any requests for more chapters. Before we move out of cat territory, though, there is one important cat fact I must deliver here. If you have taken first-year Japanese, you're probably confused by the title of the book. I Am a Cat is a very simple sentence that should be something like, Watashi wa neko desu. Except Natsume's title is Waga hai wa neko de aru, so what's going on there? The reason is that the title helps convey the nature of the narrator. Dearu is the honorific form of the verb des, to be, and wagahai is an older, very fancy-sounding pronoun from classical Japanese that's not really in use anymore. If you were going for a title translation that captured that style, it might be something like, Verily I art a cat. And because of Natsume, ever since 1905, anytime you have a talking cat in anything produced in Japan, the cat now refers to itself as wagahai. It will use that archaic pronoun to convey its sense of its own feline superiority. The most modern example I know of is the talking cat thief Morgana in the video game Persona 5. I'm sure there are many others. As you might imagine given these circumstances, the narrative of I Am a Cat can feel kind of fragmented. Honestly, there's not really a narrative at all. It's more a series of loose anecdotes, and other than familiarity with the characters themselves, there isn't much that transfers chapter to chapter. If you read one chapter, you get a sense of the whole thing. In that sense, the structure is very similar to one of the biggest influences on Natsume's writing, the 18th century classic by Lawrence Sterne, known as The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy Gentleman, or Tristram Shandy for short. If you're not familiar with this story, like I Am a Cat, Sterne's novel was published serially, though over a much longer span. I Am a Cat took 2 years. Tristram Shandy was being published from December 1759 to January 1767. It's supposed to be a narration of the life of the main character, but the joke of the whole narrative is that Tristram Shandy himself cannot explain anything simply. The story begins with his conception, and his birth does not even happen until volume 3 out of 9 total. A lot of the intervening space is taken up with observations of English society, poking fun at the foibles of British life. Sterne, a financially struggling Anglican minister before his writing took off, had a lot to say on the subject. By the way, for those of you who know your Brit lit, Natsume Soseki would later say his 3 favorite authors were Sterne, the satirist Jonathan Swift of A Modest Proposal fame, that's the joke about solving hunger by eating babies, and finally Jane Austen, proving himself once again to be a man with objectively correct literary opinions. You might remember that Natsume Soseki vastly preferred pre-Victorian British literature during his time in London, and other than Shakespeare, Tristram Shandy was apparently a personal favorite, so he really tried to imitate the style, while also sprinkling in references to everyone from the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche to the medieval Japanese poet Kukai. Just to give a few examples, in the first chapter, the narrator's master, the lazy teacher, aspires to be a better painter but laments his lack of talent. So he takes advice from a friend called the aesthete for much of the text. His name in Japanese is Meitei, which means something like the bewildered. It's usually rendered in English as Waverhouse, who is this self-proclaimed master of Western artistic sensibilities. Now, Waverhouse encourages him to sketch more and more, advice he attributes to the Florentine Renaissance painter Andrea del Sarto. The master begins to feel better about his artistic skill as a result, praising Waverhouse for his understanding of Western artistic ideas, except then Waverhouse admits he made up all the advice, and Del Sarto never said anything of the sort. He admits, in fact, to making up things on the regular, for example about Edward Gibbon's History of the French Revolution being written originally in French. Gibbon, of course, wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, but never actually wrote a history of the French Revolution, and indeed died in 1794 as the revolution was still going on, which would have made that kind of a challenge. The master's only response to learning he's been bamboozled is to ask what Waverhouse does if someone actually knows enough to call him on these things. Waverhouse waves the question off, I'll just say I misremembered the title, and then gives his friend more advice. Draw patterns from nature, like stains on a bathroom wall. Advice he claims, of course, comes originally from Leonardo da Vinci. This really gives you the flavor, I think, of a lot of the circle of Mr. Sneeze and his friends in the novel. They all want to be perceived as cultured people who understand Western philosophy, history, and art, because it's the Meiji era, and that's the mark of being a person of culture, but they're also lazy and shallow and don't want to, actually do anything that's hard. It's more about superficial concern with the appearance of looking smart than anything else. And that gives you the flavor of Soseki, but one other thing we should talk about is the language here. And here we run into the thorny question of translation. Obviously, any translated work runs into problems because, languages are different. Japanese to English translation is particularly difficult because the languages are fundamentally structurally different. English grammar goes subject-verb-object, I read the book. Japanese is subject-object-verb, I the book read, or I guess boku wa hono yomu. English is also an analytic language, modifiers come before the verb, I don't read, where Japanese is agglutinative, modifiers come after the verb, I read not, yomanai. That's without getting into the fun of honorifics or the fact that Japanese often omits part of a sentence where the meaning can be assumed, for example, the subject, if it's clear through context who's doing the action. So already Japanese to English translation is really hard. I can tell you from personal experience, I'm not good at it. Soseki makes things even more challenging because of his tendency to mix very different styles of Japanese. Educated in classical Chinese, he was a big fan of the two-character compound words that were the hallmark of educated language in Japanese as derived from Chinese, but also sprinkled in less formal language mostly reliant on the kana phonetic syllabary. I think the closest comparison in English, keeping in mind that I am not a linguist, might be something like the difference between, say, Oxbridge British English and Cockney rhyming slang, or in America between a sort of North Atlantic Ivy League accent and an Appalachian one, but it's not just pronunciation, it's the words are literally different. This makes Natsume Soseki a beast to try and translate. We've already gone over the challenges of just rendering the title, where the standard English translation does not do justice to the pomposity of either the pronoun wagahai or the verb dearu. So how does the Aiko Ito / Graham Wilson translation stack up? Well, here I have to say, I've only read the Ito-Wilson translation, so I can't speak too much comparatively. Tony Malone, who runs the very fun blog Tony's Reading List, I am definitely taking a look more at it in the future, did a great translation comparison between the Ito-Wilson version and a new one by Nick Bradley for Vintage Books that came out last year. He very nicely compiled a comparison of the first lines of the text I'm going to borrow a bit from here. Here's the Ito-Wilson version. I am a cat. As yet I have no name. I have no idea where I was born. All I remember is that I was meowing in a dampish, dark place when, for the first time, I saw a human being. This human being, I heard afterwards, was a member of the most ferocious human species, a shosei, one of those students who, in return for board and lodging, perform small chores about the house. I hear that, on occasion, this species catches, boils, and eats us. By comparison, here's the Bradley one. I, ladies and gentlemen, am a cat, but I still don't have a name. I haven't the foggiest where I was born. I only remember mewing and meowling in some gloomy darkness. That was the first place I ever saw what's known as a human. It was only later that I discovered it was the absolute worst species of human, a student. That very same kind who are often known in their abject poverty to try and catch cats, boil us in pots, and eat us. You can really hear the stylistic differences in approach. Ito and Wilson stick a lot closer to the literal meaning of the original Japanese, including keeping a word untranslated. Shosei is an older term for student that's not really in use anymore. Bradley sticks closer to the original tone, but by adding language that's less literal, inserting the ladies and gentlemen and haven't the foggiest to convey the pompous nature of the cat's language, and adding in the bit about abject poverty to make the dig on poor students in the Meiji period a bit clearer. They're so poor they have to eat cats instead of real food. It's two very different approaches to translation, one that's more academic, the other more concerned with tone at the expense of pure accuracy, so there's not really one that's better than the other, it's about what you go into the text, or any other, wanting. If you're wondering how the manga version stacks up by comparison, it's a lot closer to the Ito-Wilson one in my experience. It keeps the untranslated shosei, for example, but it uses the Japanese version of names instead of the English one, has footnotes, and is, illustrated, which makes it easier to parse in general. As for Natsume Soseki, as I've already said, I enjoyed his work a lot more than I expected to. I can see why he became so enduringly famous, and perhaps it's my own biases at play, and in particular my deep-seated hatred for the navel-gazing nature of a lot of Meiji writing, but I really feel like the lesson here is that, as a writer, the important thing is not worrying about whether the style or tone you're using matches what's in vogue. Focusing on what you have to say is what really matters. Natsume Soseki, unlike many of his contemporaries, was not caught up in a fascination for things Western, even as he had a nuanced appreciation for them. I think that makes him stand out in the best possible way. And clearly his appeal is enduring. A survey of students and professors at 4 universities conducted a few years back by Asahi Shimbun found that Natsume Soseki's works were second only to those of Fyodor Dostoevsky in their enduring influence among Japan's educated elite. By comparison, Kawabata Yasunari, the first Nobel Prize winner in Japanese history, was 17th. So in the end, I guess the lesson is, write what you know, and always trust the views of a wise cat. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the start of a multi-part series on the legend of one of the most famous figures in Japanese history, Minamoto no Yoshitsune.